It was nearly 9 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday evening when Judge Robert Hayes finished reviewing the last case file on his desk. The federal courthouse was almost empty, with only the security guards making their rounds through the dimly lit hallways. Robert gathered his papers, locked his office, and headed toward the parking garage where his 10-year-old Honda Accord waited. At 52 years old, Robert had been serving as a federal judge for over 15 years. He wasn't the type to flaunt his position or drive expensive cars. His colleagues often joked about how he still drove the same modest sedan he bought when he first got the job. "A car just needs to get you from point A to point B," he would always say with a smile. The drive home usually took about 20 minutes through the suburban neighborhoods surrounding the courthouse. Robert enjoyed these quiet moments after long days filled with complex legal cases and difficult decisions. He kept his radio tuned to a classical music station, letting the peaceful melodies help him unwind from the stress of his work. As he turned onto Maple Street, a residential road lined with well-maintained houses and old oak trees, Robert noticed his speedometer showed exactly 28 miles in the 30-mile zone. He had always been careful about following traffic laws, understanding better than most how important it was for someone in his position to set a good example. That's when he saw the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Robert's first thought was confusion. He glanced at his speedometer again, then checked to make sure his headlights were on and his seatbelt was fastened. Everything seemed normal. He pulled over to the side of the road, turned off his radio, and rolled down his window while keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel. Officer Bradley Thompson approached the car with a flashlight beam dancing across the pavement. Bradley was in his early 30s with a buzz cut and the kind of swagger that came from 5 years on the force. He had made more traffic stops in this neighborhood than he could count, but something about this particular car and driver had caught his attention. "License and registration," Bradley said curtly without any of the usual polite greeting most officers offered during routine stops. "Good evening, officer," Robert replied calmly, reaching slowly toward his glove compartment. "May I ask what the reason for the stop is?" "You were speeding," Bradley answered quickly, though he hadn't actually clocked Robert's speed. Something about the situation just felt off to him, and he had learned to trust his instincts on the street. Robert handed over his driver's license along with his vehicle registration, but he also included his federal judicial identification card. "Officer, I'm actually Federal Judge Robert Hayes from the district courthouse. I believe there might be some mistake about the speeding." Bradley took the documents but barely glanced at the federal ID before focusing on the regular driver's license. When he saw the name and address, his expression hardened slightly. This neighborhood had been having issues with break-ins lately, and seeing an older sedan with a driver who didn't look like he belonged in this area raised red flags in Bradley's mind. "Step out of the vehicle," Bradley commanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Robert said, maintaining his calm tone despite the growing tension. "If you look at my federal identification, you'll see that I'm a sitting judge. I work at the courthouse just a few miles from here." "I said step out of the vehicle," Bradley repeated more forcefully. "And keep your hands where I can see them." Robert felt his heart rate increase, but he knew that arguing would only make things worse. He had presided over enough cases to understand how quickly situations like this could escalate. Slowly, he opened his car door and stepped onto the sidewalk, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Turn around and place your hands on the car," Bradley instructed, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. "Officer Thompson," Robert said, reading the name tag on Bradley's uniform, "I really need you to take a closer look at my federal identification. I'm Judge Robert Hayes, and I've been serving on the federal bench for 15 years. I'm just driving home from work." Bradley glanced at the federal ID card again, but something about it struck him as suspicious. The photo looked professional, almost too professional, and he had never seen a federal judge drive such an old, beat-up car. In his experience, important people drove nice vehicles that matched their status. "This looks fake to me," Bradley said, holding up the ID card. "I've never seen a real judge drive a car like this. You expect me to believe someone important enough to be a federal judge can't afford a decent vehicle?" Robert felt a chill run down his spine. He recognized the tone in the officer's voice, the assumption being made based purely on appearance and circumstances rather than facts. "Officer, I can assure you that identification is completely authentic. If you call the federal courthouse, they can verify my identity within minutes." "Yeah, right," Bradley scoffed. "I'm sure you've got friends who would back up your story. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "What?" Robert couldn't hide his shock anymore. "Officer, you cannot be serious. I am a federal judge. This is a massive misunderstanding that can be cleared up with one phone call." Bradley was already reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for impersonating a federal official, and probably for whatever you were really doing driving around this neighborhood at night. I've seen this scam before." Robert's mind raced. He knew that resisting, even verbally, would only make the situation worse. He had seen too many cases where minor incidents escalated into serious charges because someone couldn't remain calm under pressure. Despite every instinct telling him to protest more vigorously, he forced himself to comply. "Officer, I am not resisting, but I need you to understand that you are making a serious mistake," Robert said as he felt the cold metal of the handcuffs around his wrists. "I am telling you the truth about who I am." Bradley secured the handcuffs and began walking Robert toward his patrol car. "Save it for the judge," he said with bitter irony, completely missing the significance of his words. As they walked, Robert noticed that several porch lights had come on in the surrounding houses. A few neighbors had stepped outside to see what was happening, and he could see at least one person holding up a phone, likely recording the entire incident. "Officer, those people are recording this," Robert said quietly. "When they verify my identity, this video is going to show that you arrested a federal judge based on assumptions rather than evidence." Bradley paused for a moment, glancing around at the gathering neighbors, but his pride was too invested in his decision to back down now. "Let them record," he said. "They'll see me doing my job and catching someone trying to impersonate a federal official." Robert sat in the back of the patrol car, the handcuffs cutting into his wrists, watching as Bradley returned to search his vehicle. Through the windshield, he could see the officer going through his briefcase, pulling out court documents, legal briefs, and official correspondence that clearly bore the federal court seal. For a moment, Robert allowed himself to hope that the evidence would speak for itself. Surely, when Bradley saw the authentic court documents with matching names and official seals, he would realize his mistake and apologize for the misunderstanding. But as he watched Bradley examine each document, Robert saw the officer's expression grow more determined rather than less certain. It was as if Bradley had convinced himself that this was an elaborate con game, and the more authentic the documents appeared, the more sophisticated he believed the scam to be. "Nice fake documents," Bradley said loudly enough for the neighbors to hear as he returned to the patrol car. "Whoever set you up with these really went all out. They even got the federal court seal looking pretty realistic." Robert closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He realized that this situation was far beyond a simple misunderstanding. This was going to require backup, supervisors, and probably several phone calls to sort out. What should have been a routine evening drive home had turned into something that could potentially affect his career, his reputation, and his family. As Bradley called for backup and began filling out paperwork, Robert could only sit in the back seat and hope that when more experienced officers arrived, cooler heads would prevail. He thought about his wife at home, probably wondering why he was late for dinner, completely unaware that her husband was sitting in handcuffs in the back of a police car, arrested for the crime of being exactly who he claimed to be. The back seat of Officer Thompson's patrol car felt smaller than any courtroom Robert had ever sat in. The handcuffs were tight enough to restrict blood flow, but he knew better than to complain. Through the window, he could see more neighbors, gathering on their porches and sidewalks, their phones held high, recording everything that was happening. Bradley finished searching through Robert's car and walked back to the patrol vehicle with a stack of documents in his hands. Robert could see court briefs, federal case files, and official correspondence that he had been reviewing earlier that evening. Any reasonable person looking at these materials would immediately recognize their authenticity, but Bradley's expression showed nothing but stubborn determination. "You really went all out with this fake identity thing," Bradley said as he opened the driver's door and slid behind the wheel. "I've got to admit, these documents look pretty convincing. Someone put a lot of work into setting up this whole scam." "Officer Thompson," Robert said, his voice steady despite the surreal nature of the conversation. "Those documents are real because I am real. Every piece of paper in that briefcase bears my name and signature. The federal court seal isn't something you can fake at a local print shop." Bradley turned around to face Robert through the protective barrier. "Look, I've been doing this job for 5 years. I know a con when I see one. Rich neighborhoods like this are always targets for people running scams. You probably case these houses during the day and come back at night to break in." Robert felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. "Officer, I live 12 minutes from here. My house is in the public record. My judicial appointment was confirmed by the United States Senate and reported in every major newspaper. This isn't a scam or a con game. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding that's getting worse by the minute." "Yeah, well, we'll see about that when we get to the station," Bradley replied, turning back around to face forward. "The detectives will sort out your whole story." As they sat waiting for backup to arrive, Robert watched more neighbors emerge from their houses. He recognized a few faces from the grocery store and the local coffee shop where he sometimes stopped on weekend mornings. These were people who might have seen him around the neighborhood, but none of them knew him well enough to vouch for his identity. A middle-aged woman in a bathrobe approached the passenger side of the patrol car. She tapped gently on the window and Bradley rolled it down halfway. "Officer, what's going on here?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "We've never had any trouble in this neighborhood before." "Ma'am, I need you to step back," Bradley said professionally. "We've apprehended a suspect who was impersonating a federal judge. The situation is under control." Robert wanted to call out, to tell the woman who he really was, but he knew that would only make things worse. Instead, he sat quietly, watching as more phone cameras pointed in his direction. He understood that within hours, maybe minutes, this footage would be online. His colleagues, his family, and possibly the entire legal community would see him, sitting in handcuffs in the back of a police car. The woman stepped back but didn't go inside. Instead, she pulled out her own phone and began recording. "Officer, that man doesn't look like any criminal I've ever seen. Are you sure you've got the right person?" Bradley's patience was wearing thin. "Ma'am, I need everyone to clear the area. This is official police business." But the neighbors weren't leaving. If anything, more people were coming outside. Robert could see children pressing their faces against windows while their parents recorded from porches and driveways. The scene was turning into a community event, and Robert realized that this was probably the most excitement this quiet residential street had seen in years. 20 minutes passed before backup arrived. Robert saw another patrol car pull up behind Bradley's vehicle, its red and blue lights adding to the spectacle. A female officer stepped out and immediately surveyed the crowd of onlookers before walking toward Bradley's car. Officer Linda Rodriguez had been with the department for 12 years and had developed a reputation for level-headed thinking in tense situations. She could tell immediately that something unusual was happening. Traffic stops didn't normally draw crowds of neighbors with cell phones, and the man in the back of Bradley's car didn't fit the profile of typical suspects she encountered. "What do we have here, Thompson?" Linda asked as Bradley stepped out of his patrol car. "Caught this guy impersonating a federal judge," Bradley said with obvious pride. "He's got fake documents, fake ID, the whole 9 yards. Claims he was just driving home from work, but I think he was casing houses in this neighborhood." Linda walked around to look at Robert through the rear window. Something about his posture, his clothing, and his calm demeanor struck her as unusual. Most people arrested for serious crimes were either angry, scared, or trying to bargain their way out of trouble. This man looked like he was patiently waiting for adults to sort out a problem that children had created. "Did you run his name through the system?" Linda asked. Bradley hesitated for a moment. "I was waiting for backup before processing everything. But look at these fake documents he had in his car." Linda took the stack of papers and began examining them more carefully than Bradley had. The federal court letterhead looked authentic, with raised seals and official formatting that would be difficult to replicate. The legal briefs were complex and detailed, written in the kind of formal language that real attorneys and judges used. "Thompson, have you actually verified whether this identification is fake?" Linda asked, holding up Robert's federal judicial ID. "It has to be fake," Bradley insisted. "Look at the car he was driving. Look at him. You think a real federal judge would be driving around in a beat-up Honda at 9 o'clock at night?" Linda studied the ID card more carefully. The photo was clearly professional, taken in what looked like an official government building. The printing quality was high grade, with security features that would be nearly impossible to counterfeit. Most importantly, the man in the photo matched exactly the man sitting in the back of the patrol car. "Thompson, I think we need to verify this identity before we go any further," Linda said quietly. "Come on, Rodriguez," Bradley replied. "You know as well as I do that these con artists are getting more sophisticated every year. Someone put a lot of money into setting up this fake identity." Linda walked to the rear window and tapped on the glass. Robert looked up and made eye contact with her. She could see intelligence in his eyes, along with the kind of patience that came from years of dealing with complex problems professionally. "Sir, I'm Officer Rodriguez," she said through the glass. "Can you tell me exactly who you are and what you were doing tonight?" "Officer Rodriguez, my name is Robert Hayes and I'm a federal district judge for the Northern District. I was driving home from my office at the federal courthouse after working late on case reviews. I live about 10 minutes from here and I take this route every night." Linda nodded and walked back to Bradley. "I'm going to run his name through the federal database," she said. "You're wasting time," Bradley protested. "Even if his name comes up somewhere, it doesn't mean he's really who he claims to be. Identity theft is more common than you think." But Linda was already walking back to her patrol car to access her computer terminal. She entered Robert's name and date of birth into the federal law enforcement database, and within 30 seconds, she had her answer. The screen displayed a detailed profile. Robert Hayes, Federal District Judge, Northern District, appointed 15 years ago, currently residing at an address that was indeed 10 minutes from their current location. The photo matched perfectly, and the system showed no outstanding warrants, no criminal history, and active federal judicial credentials. Linda stared at the screen for a long moment, then looked back at Bradley, who was standing near his patrol car looking confident about his arrest. She realized that they were about to become the center of a story that would not end well for anyone involved, especially Bradley. Walking back to Bradley's car, Linda opened the rear door where Robert was sitting. "Judge Hayes, I sincerely apologize for this situation. We're going to get you uncuffed immediately." "What are you doing?" Bradley demanded. "You're falling for his con game." Linda turned to face her colleague with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Thompson, that's actually Federal Judge Robert Hayes. I just verified his identity through the federal database. We just handcuffed a sitting federal judge." The color drained from Bradley's face as Linda's words sank in. He stood frozen next to the patrol car, watching as she carefully helped Judge Hayes out of the back seat and began working to remove the handcuffs. "That can't be right," Bradley said, his voice cracking slightly. "Run the check again. These identity thieves are getting better at hacking systems." Linda had already removed one handcuff and was working on the second when she turned to look at Bradley with disbelief. "Thompson, I ran his name 3 times. The federal database doesn't lie. This man is exactly who he says he is." Judge Hayes rubbed his wrists where the handcuffs had left red marks, but his expression remained calm and dignified. "Officer Rodriguez, I appreciate your professionalism in handling this situation. I understand that mistakes happen, and I'm not interested in making this more difficult than it needs to be." Bradley's mind was racing. He looked around at the crowd of neighbors who were still recording everything with their phones. Some of them had been broadcasting live on social media, which meant this incident was already spreading beyond the immediate neighborhood. The thought of trying to explain this to his supervisor made his stomach turn. "Judge Hayes," Linda said formally, "on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for this misunderstanding. Is there anything we can do to make this right?" Robert straightened his tie and brushed off his jacket. "The most important thing now is making sure this doesn't happen to someone else. Officer Thompson made several assumptions based on my appearance and my vehicle, rather than examining the evidence I provided. Bradley finally found his voice again. Look, anyone can make fake documents these days. How was I supposed to know? They were real? And you have to admit most judges don't drive cars like that. Robert turned to face Bradley directly. Officer Thompson, that's exactly the problem. You decided I couldn't be who I said I was because I didn't match your expectations of what a federal judge should look like or drive. That's not police work. That's profiling. The crowd of neighbors was growing larger, and Robert noticed several people on phones, probably calling friends and family to tell them what was happening. He knew that within hours this story would be all over local news and social media. Linda was reading through the documents Bradley had taken from Robert's car, and her expression grew more troubled with each page. Thompson, these are real federal court documents. Look at the case numbers, the official seals, the legal language. This isn't something you can fake at Kinko's. I know they look real, Bradley said defensively, but criminals are getting more sophisticated. I've been to training seminars about this stuff. Robert watched this exchange with fascination. As a judge, he had seen many cases where police officers had to admit mistakes, but he had never been on the receiving end of such a fundamental error in judgment. What struck him most was Bradley's inability to acknowledge the obvious truth even when presented with overwhelming evidence. Linda's radio crackled to life. Unit 47, what's your status on the traffic stop? Linda looked at Robert apologetically before keying her radio. Dispatch, we have a situation here that's going to require a supervisor. Can you send Sergeant Miller to our location? Copy that. Sergeant Miller is en route. ETA 5 minutes. Robert knew this was when things would get serious. Police supervisors were trained to recognize potential liability issues, and arresting a federal judge would definitely qualify as a major problem for the department. One of the neighbors, an elderly man in pajamas and a bathrobe, approached the officers. Excuse me, but I think I recognize this gentleman. Don't you work at the federal courthouse downtown? Robert nodded. Yes, sir. I'm Judge Hayes. I've been working there for 15 years. The man turned to Bradley. Officer, I think you made a big mistake here. I've seen this man's picture in the newspaper when he was nominated for the bench. He's the real deal. Bradley's face was now completely red. Whether from embarrassment or anger was hard to tell. Sir, I need you to step back and let us handle this situation. But the neighbor wasn't finished. My son is a lawyer and he's appeared in Judge Hayes' courtroom. I'm calling him right now to confirm this man's identity. Linda realized that the situation was spiraling beyond their control. More neighbors were arriving, more phones were recording, and now they had potential witnesses who could verify Judge Hayes' identity independently. She needed to contain this situation before it became a department-wide embarrassment. Judge Hayes, Linda said, would you be willing to wait for our sergeant to arrive so we can sort this out officially? Of course, Robert replied. But I think it's important that everyone understands what happened here. Officer Thompson didn't arrest me because he had evidence of a crime. He arrested me because he decided I didn't look like his idea of what a federal judge should be. Bradley couldn't stay quiet any longer. That's not fair. I was doing my job. People impersonate officials all the time. How was I supposed to know you were really a judge? Robert gestured toward his car, where the documents were still scattered across the seats. You could have looked at the evidence. You could have called the courthouse to verify my identity. You could have treated my federal identification as authentic until proven otherwise. Instead, you decided it was fake because you didn't like my car. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Kevin Miller, a 20-year veteran, who had seen just about everything during his career. As soon as he stepped out of his patrol car and assessed the scene, he knew this was going to be a problem. The crowd of neighbors, the multiple phones recording, and the obvious tension between his officers told him everything he needed to know. Someone had made a serious mistake, and now it was his job to clean up the mess. What do we have here? Sergeant Miller asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be good. Linda quickly filled him in on the situation, explaining how Bradley had arrested the man for impersonating a federal judge, and how her database check had confirmed that he actually was a federal judge. Sergeant Miller listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at Robert and then at the crowd of neighbors. When Linda finished her explanation, he walked over to Robert and extended his hand. "Judge Hayes, I'm Sergeant Miller. I am deeply sorry about this situation. I've actually testified in your courtroom twice over the past few years." Robert shook the sergeant's hand. "I remember you, Sergeant Miller. You handled both of those cases professionally, which makes this situation even more unfortunate." Sergeant Miller turned to Bradley, and his expression was not friendly. "Thompson, step over here with me for a moment." As the two officers walked, a few yards away, Robert could see Sergeant Miller speaking in urgent, hushed tones, while Bradley's expression grew more and more distressed. The conversation lasted several minutes, with the sergeant occasionally pointing toward Robert and then toward the crowd of neighbors. While they talked, Linda approached Robert again. "Judge Hayes, I know this has been a terrible experience, but I want you to know that not all of us would have handled it this way. Officer Thompson is relatively new, and sometimes new officers make poor judgment calls." "I appreciate that, Officer Rodriguez," Robert replied. "But the problem isn't that he's new. The problem is that he made assumptions based on my appearance rather than examining the evidence. That's a pattern that can lead to much more serious consequences for other people in different situations." Linda nodded, understanding the broader implications of what Robert was saying. She had been in law enforcement long enough to know that this kind of incident could damage community trust and create long-lasting problems for the department. Sergeant Miller returned, looking grim. "Judge Hayes, I want to personally apologize for this incident. Officer Thompson acted without proper procedure, and there will be consequences for his actions." Robert appreciated the apology, but he could see that the damage was already done. The crowd of neighbors was still growing. More phones were still recording, and he was certain that by morning, this story would be news far beyond this quiet residential street. "Sergeant Miller," Robert said, "I think the most important thing now is making sure this becomes a learning experience. Your department needs to understand why this happened and how to prevent it from happening again." As if on cue, several cars, with news station logos, began arriving at the scene. Someone in the crowd had obviously called local media, and now reporters with cameras were setting up to cover the story. Sergeant Miller looked at the news vans and muttered something under his breath. He knew that within hours his phone would be ringing with calls from the police chief, the mayor, and probably federal officials who would want explanations for why one of their judges had been handcuffed and arrested. "Judge Hayes," Sergeant Miller said, "we need to make this right. What can we do?" The first news van belonged to Channel 7, followed quickly by vehicles from 3 other local stations. Within minutes, reporters were setting up cameras and trying to interview neighbors who had witnessed the entire incident. The quiet, residential street had transformed into a media circus. Reporter Kelly Chen from Channel 7 was the first to approach the scene. She had been covering local news for 8 years and immediately recognized that this was a much bigger story than a routine traffic stop. The crowd of neighbors, the obvious tension between police officers, and the multiple patrol cars suggested something significant had happened. "Excuse me," Kelly said to one of the neighbors who had been recording on his phone. "Can you tell me what happened here tonight?" "A police officer arrested that man," the neighbor replied, pointing toward Judge Hayes, claiming he was impersonating a federal judge, but it turns out he really is a federal judge. The whole thing was caught on video. Kelly's eyes widened as she processed this information. A police officer arresting a real federal judge for impersonating himself was exactly the kind of story that would go viral within hours. She immediately signaled her cameraman to start recording. Sergeant Miller saw the reporters approaching and knew he had to act quickly to control the narrative. "Judge Hayes, would you be willing to speak with me privately for a moment before this gets any more public?" "Sergeant, I think it's already quite public," Robert replied, gesturing toward the cameras and reporters who were now interviewing neighbors and reviewing phone footage of the arrest. "The question now is how your department is going to handle this situation." Bradley had been standing quietly near his patrol car, watching the media arrive with growing horror. He understood that his career was probably over, but more than that, he was beginning to realize the magnitude of his mistake. This wasn't just about arresting the wrong person. He had handcuffed a federal judge based purely on assumptions and prejudice. Officer Rodriguez approached Bradley with a concerned expression. "Thompson, you need to prepare yourself. This is going to be investigated at the highest levels, internal affairs, maybe even federal civil rights investigators. I was just doing my job, Bradley said weakly, though he no longer sounded convinced of his own words. No, you weren't, Rodriguez replied bluntly. Your job is to follow evidence and procedure. You ignored both. Meanwhile, Kelly Chen had managed to get close enough to Judge Hayes to request an interview. Your Honor, I'm Kelly Chen from Channel 7 News. Would you be willing to share what happened here tonight? Robert considered the request carefully. As a federal judge, he usually avoided media attention, but he realized this situation had implications far beyond his personal experience. Ms. Chen, I think it's important for the community to understand what happened here, not just for my sake, but to prevent similar incidents in the future. Kelly signaled her cameraman to start recording as she positioned herself next to Judge Hayes. Your Honor, can you walk us through what happened tonight? I was driving home from work at the federal courthouse when Officer Thompson pulled me over. Robert began, his voice calm and measured. When I provided my identification, including my federal judicial credentials, he refused to believe they were authentic. Despite my attempts to explain who I was and offer ways to verify my identity, he arrested me for impersonating a federal official. What went through your mind when you realized you were being arrested? Kelly asked. I was obviously shocked and concerned, Robert replied. But I also understood that resisting would only make the situation worse. What troubles me most is that Officer Thompson made his decision based on assumptions rather than evidence. He decided I couldn't be a federal judge because I didn't match his expectations of what a judge should look like or drive. The interview was being broadcast live, and within minutes the story was spreading across social media platforms. Videos recorded by neighbors were already being shared thousands of times, with hashtags like Judge Arrested and Tawner Police Profiling trending locally. Sergeant Miller's radio crackled with an urgent message from dispatch. Sergeant Miller, please call headquarters immediately. We have media inquiries and calls from federal court officials. Miller stepped away from the crowd to make the call, and when he returned, his expression was grave. Judge Hayes, I just spoke with Chief Anderson. He's en route to the scene, and he asked me to extend his personal apologies for this incident. I appreciate that, Sergeant, Robert replied. But apologies won't fix the underlying problem. Your officer made a series of decisions based on bias rather than police work. By now, more neighbors had gathered, and several of them were sharing their own stories with reporters about seeing Judge Hayes in the neighborhood over the years. The elderly man in pajamas was speaking with a Channel 4 reporter about how he had recognized the judge from newspaper photos. I knew something was wrong when I saw him in handcuffs, the man was saying. That's Judge Hayes. He's been on the federal bench for years. Any officer who bothered to check would have known who he was. Bradley overheard this comment and felt his stomach clench. The reality of his mistake was becoming undeniable, not just to him, but to everyone watching. The evidence of Judge Hayes's identity had been available from the beginning, but he had chosen to ignore it. A black SUV with government plates pulled up to the scene, and Chief Anderson stepped out along with two other officials Robert didn't recognize. The chief was a 30-year veteran of law enforcement who had worked hard to build community relationships, and he knew this incident threatened to undo years of progress. Chief Anderson walked directly to Judge Hayes and extended his hand. Your Honor, I'm Chief Anderson. I cannot adequately express how sorry I am about what happened tonight. This does not represent the values or training of our department. Chief Anderson, I appreciate your response, Robert replied, but we need to talk about why this happened and how to prevent it from happening again. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a pattern of decision-making based on assumptions and bias. The chief nodded grimly. You're absolutely right, Your Honor. Officer Thompson will be suspended pending a full investigation. We take this matter extremely seriously. Kelly Chen had been listening to this conversation and immediately approached with her microphone. Chief Anderson, what disciplinary action will be taken against the officer involved? We are launching a full internal investigation, the chief replied carefully. And Officer Thompson has been suspended from active duty effective immediately. We are also reviewing our training procedures to ensure something like this never happens again. But Chief, Kelly pressed, how does an officer with 5 years of experience mistake a federal judge for a criminal impersonator? What does this say about your department's training and procedures? The chief's discomfort was obvious as cameras recorded his every expression. We will be conducting a thorough review of this incident, and we will take appropriate action based on our findings. Judge Hayes stepped forward. If I may address that question, Ms. Chen. This incident happened because an officer made assumptions based on my appearance and my vehicle, rather than examining the evidence I provided. That's not a training issue. That's a bias issue. The crowd fell silent as Robert continued. I was treated as guilty until proven innocent, and even when I provided proof of my innocence, that proof was dismissed because it didn't fit preconceived notions about what a federal judge should look like. Bradley, who had been standing quietly nearby, finally couldn't take it anymore. He approached the group with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Your Honor, I need to apologize. I made a terrible mistake, and I know that now. The cameras immediately focused on Bradley as he continued. I should have taken your identification seriously from the beginning. I should have verified your identity instead of assuming it was fake. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry. Robert looked at Bradley for a long moment before responding. Officer Thompson, I accept your apology, but an apology doesn't fix the damage that's been done. This incident will follow both of us for the rest of our careers, but more importantly, it highlights a problem that affects many people who don't have federal judicial credentials to protect them. The truth of Robert's words hung in the air as reporters continued recording and neighbors continued watching. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something much larger than a simple traffic stop gone wrong. Chief Anderson's radio crackled with another urgent message. Chief Anderson, we have calls coming in from the mayor's office, the federal court, and several civil rights organizations. Media requests are flooding in from national networks. As if to prove the point, 2 more news vans arrived on the scene, these bearing logos from regional networks that covered multiple states. The story was expanding beyond local news to become a national conversation about police procedures, bias, and accountability. Robert watched all of this unfold with a mixture of sadness and determination. He had never wanted to become the center of a media storm, but he realized that his platform as a federal judge gave him both an opportunity and a responsibility to address these larger issues. Chief Anderson, Robert said, I think we need to have a longer. By midnight, the story had exploded across social media and national news networks. The video footage captured by neighbors showed the entire incident from multiple angles, creating an undeniable record of what had transpired on Maple Street. Major news outlets were picking up the story, and it was trending nationally on Twitter with hashtags like Judge Arrested and Justice for Judge Hayes. Judge Hayes finally arrived home at nearly 1 a.m. to find his wife Catherine waiting up for him. Having seen the news coverage on television, she rushed to embrace him as he walked through the front door, her eyes filled with tears of relief and anger. Robert, I saw it on the news, Catherine said, holding him tightly. I can't believe what that officer put you through. Are you okay? I'm fine. Physically, Robert replied, though the emotional weight of the evening was evident in his voice. But Catherine, this is bigger than what happened to me tonight. This is about a pattern of behavior that affects people who don't have the protection that comes with my position. The next morning brought a flood of phone calls, emails, and interview requests. Robert's phone started ringing at 6 a.m., with calls from fellow judges, attorneys, civil rights organizations, and media outlets from across the country. The story had become a national conversation about police accountability and racial profiling. Chief Anderson held a press conference at 10 a.m., flanked by city officials and community leaders. The room was packed with reporters, and cameras from major networks broadcast the event live. Yesterday evening, one of our officers made a serious error in judgment, Chief Anderson began, his voice heavy with the weight of the situation. Federal Judge Robert Hayes was wrongfully arrested during what should have been a routine traffic stop. This incident does not reflect the values of our department or our community. A reporter immediately raised her hand. Chief Anderson, what specific actions are you taking in response to this incident? Officer Bradley Thompson has been suspended without pay, pending a full investigation, the chief replied. We are also reviewing all of our training protocols and implementing immediate changes to prevent similar incidents. Additionally, we will be working with federal civil rights investigators who have opened their own inquiry into this matter. The questions continued for over an hour, with reporters pressing for details about the department's procedures, Officer Thompson's history, and what systemic changes would be implemented. Meanwhile, across town at the federal courthouse, Judge Hayes was meeting with Chief Judge Patricia Williams and several other federal officials. The conversation was serious and focused on the broader implications of the incident. Robert, we support you completely in whatever actions you choose to take, Chief Judge Williams said. This attack on your dignity is an attack on the integrity of the federal judiciary itself. I appreciate that support, Robert replied, but I want to be clear about something. My goal isn't revenge against Officer Thompson or even the police department. My goal is ensuring that this becomes a catalyst for real change in how law enforcement interacts with the community. The meeting was interrupted by a phone call from the Department of Justice in Washington. Federal civil rights investigators were formally opening an investigation into the incident, treating it as a potential violation of Judge Hayes's civil rights under federal law. Throughout the day, support poured in from unexpected sources. The local bar association issued a statement condemning the arrest. Civil rights organizations offered their assistance. Even police reform advocates reached out to discuss how the incident could be used to promote positive changes in law enforcement. Officer Thompson, meanwhile, was at home facing the reality that his law enforcement career was likely over. The incident had been captured on video from multiple angles, broadcast nationally, and condemned by officials at every level. He had become the face of everything wrong with modern policing. His phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters, wanting his side of the story, but his lawyer had advised him to remain silent while internal affairs and federal investigators conducted their reviews. By the end of the week, the story had prompted discussions in police departments across the country about bias training, proper identification procedures, and community relations. Several departments announced new policies requiring officers to verify suspicious identification through official channels before making arrests. Judge Hayes used his unexpected platform to speak at a community forum organized by local civil rights groups. The auditorium was packed with residents, police officers, city officials, and community leaders. What happened to me last week was wrong, Judge Hayes told the crowd. But I want everyone to understand that I was protected by my position and my credentials in ways that many people are not. The real tragedy would be if we let this incident pass without using it to make meaningful changes, he continued. Officer Thompson made assumptions based on my appearance and my vehicle, rather than examining the evidence. That kind of bias doesn't just affect federal judges, it affects ordinary citizens who don't have the protection that comes with my position. The audience listened intently as he outlined specific recommendations for police reform, community engagement, and bias training. His message was clear. This incident should be a turning point, not just a news story. Chief Anderson, who was also speaking at the forum, announced several concrete changes the department would implement immediately. These included mandatory bias training for all officers, new protocols for verifying identification, and the establishment of a community oversight board. Judge Hayes has shown remarkable grace in how he's handled this situation, Chief Anderson said. He could have demanded Officer Thompson's termination and sued our department. Instead, he's working with us to make sure this never happens to anyone else. The federal investigation moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, the Department of Justice announced that Officer Thompson would face federal civil rights charges for violating Judge Hayes's constitutional rights. The charges carried potential prison time and would effectively end any possibility of Thompson working in law enforcement again. Judge Hayes met privately with Officer Thompson's attorney to discuss a possible plea agreement that would include community service focused on police reform and bias education. He wanted Thompson to face consequences for his actions, but he also wanted those consequences to contribute to positive change. Your Honor, Thompson's attorney said during the meeting, my client knows he made a terrible mistake. He's willing to accept responsibility and work toward making amends. The amends aren't to me, Judge Hayes replied. The amends are to the community and to every person who might face similar treatment in the future. 3 months after the incident, Officer Thompson pled guilty to violating Judge Hayes's civil rights. As part of his sentence, he was required to participate in a community education program, speaking at police academies and community forums about the dangers of bias and assumption in law enforcement. The police department implemented sweeping changes, including new training programs, revised procedures for handling identification verification, and regular community forums, where residents could voice concerns about police practices. Judge Hayes returned to his normal routine at the courthouse, but he continued to speak publicly about police reform and community relations. The incident had given him a platform he never wanted but felt obligated to use responsibly. The story became a case study in police academies across the country, used to teach new officers about the importance of following evidence rather than assumptions. Video footage of the incident was shown in training sessions, followed by discussions about bias, proper procedure, and community relations. A year later, Judge Hayes was invited to speak at the Police Academy graduation ceremony. Standing before 60 new officers about to begin their careers, he offered them advice that had grown out of his experience on Maple Street. Your job is to serve and protect all members of your community, he told them. That means treating everyone with dignity and respect regardless of what they look like, what they drive, or where you encounter them. Evidence and facts should guide your decisions, not assumptions and prejudice. The incident that began as a routine traffic stop had evolved into something much larger, a national conversation about justice, accountability, and the possibility of positive change. Judge Hayes had turned his worst professional experience into a catalyst for reform, proving that even in moments of injustice, the truth can ultimately prevail and lead to meaningful progress. Officer Thompson, despite losing his career, eventually found purpose in his new role as an educator about the consequences of bias in law enforcement. His story, paired with Judge Hayes's message of reform rather than revenge, became a powerful example of how accountability and redemption could work together to create positive change. The incident on Maple Street had exposed serious problems in the relationship between law enforcement and the community, but it had also demonstrated that those problems could be addressed when people of goodwill worked together toward common solutions. Judge Hayes had proven that dignity, grace, and determination could triumph over prejudice and injustice, creating lasting change that would benefit future generations.